Oh, hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 27. The Giant Again. A taxicab drew up before an old-fashioned residence upon the outskirts of Baltimore. A man of about 40, well-built and with strong, regular features, stepped out, and paying the chauffeur, dismissed him. A moment later, the passenger was entering the library of the old home. "Ah, Mr. Candler!" exclaimed an old man, rising to greet him. "Good evening, my dear professor," cried the man, extending a cordial hand. "Who admitted you?" asked the professor. "Esmeralda." "Then she will acquaint Jane with the fact that you are here," said the old man. "No, professor," replied Candler, "for I came primarily to see you." "Ah, I am honored," said Professor Porter. "Professor," continued Robert Candler with great deliberation, as though carefully weighing his words, "I have come this evening to speak with you about Jane. You know my aspirations, and you have been generous enough to approve my suit." Professor Archimedes Q. Porter fidgeted in his armchair. The subject always made him uncomfortable. He could not understand why. Candler was a splendid match. "But Jane," continued Candler, "I cannot understand her. She puts me off first, on one ground and then another. I have always the feeling that she breathes a sigh of relief every time I bid her goodbye." "Tut, tut," said Professor Porter. "Tut, tut, Mr. Candler. Jane is a most obedient daughter. She will do precisely as I tell her." "Then can I still count on your support?" asked Candler, a tone of relief marking his voice. Certainly, sir, exclaimed Professor Porter. "How could you doubt it?" "There is young Clayton, you know," suggested Candler. "He has been hanging about for months. I don't know that Jane cares for him, but beside his title, they say he has inherited a very considerable estate from his father, and it might not be strange if he finally won her, unless—" And Candler paused. "Tut, tut, tut, Mr. Candler, unless what?" "Unless you see fit to request that Jane and I be married at once," said Candler, slowly and distinctly. "I have already suggested to Jane that it would be desirable," said Professor Porter sadly, "for we can no longer afford to keep up this house and live as her associations demand." "What was her reply?" asked Candler. "She said she was not ready to marry anyone yet," replied Professor Porter, "and that we could go and live upon the farm in northern Wisconsin which her mother left her. It is a little more than self-supporting. The tenants have always made a living from it and been able to send Jane a trifle beside each year. She is planning on going up there the first of the week. Philander and Mr. Clayton have already gone to get things in readiness for us." "Clayton has gone there!" exclaimed Candler, visibly chagrined. "Why was I not told? I would gladly have gone and seen that every comfort was provided." "Jane feels that we are already too much in your debt, Mr. Candler," said Professor Porter. Candler was about to reply when the sound of footsteps came from the hall without. and Jane entered the room. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she exclaimed, pausing on the threshold. "I thought you were alone, Papa." "It is only I, Jane," said Candler, who had risen. "Won't you come in and join the family group? We were just speaking of you." "Thank you," said Jane, entering and taking the chair Candler placed for her. "I only wanted to tell Papa that Toby is coming down from the college tomorrow to pack his books. I want you to be sure, Papa, to indicate all that you can do without until fail. To indicate all that you can do without until fall. Please don't carry this entire library to Wisconsin, as you would have carried it to Africa if I had not put my foot down." "Was Toby here?" asked Professor Porter. "Yes, I just left him. He and Esmeralda are exchanging religious experiences on the back porch now." "Tut, tut, I must see him at once," cried the professor. "Excuse me just a moment, children," and the old man hastened from the room. As soon as he was out of earshot, Candler turned to Jane. "See here, Jane," he said bluntly. "How long is this thing going on like this? You haven't refused to marry me, but you haven't promised either. I want to get the license tomorrow so that we can be married quietly before you leave for Wisconsin. I don't care for any fuss or feathers, and I'm sure you don't either." The girl turned cold, but she held her head bravely. "Your father wishes it, you know," added Candler. "Yes, I know." She spoke scarcely above a whisper. "Don't you realize that you are buying me, Mr. Candler?" she said finally, in a cold, level voice. "Buying me for a few paltry dollars? Of course you do, Robert Candler. And the hope of just such a contingency was in your mind when you loaned Papa the money for that hare-brained escapade, which but for a most mysterious circumstance would have been surprisingly successful. But you, Mr. Candler, would have been the most surprised. You had no idea that the venture would succeed. You are too good a businessman for that, and you are too good a businessman to loan money for buried treasure seeking, or to loan money without security unless you had some special object in view. You knew that without security you had a greater hold on the honor of the Porters than with it. You knew the one best way to force me to marry you without seeming to force me. You have never mentioned the loan. In any other man, I should have thought that the prompting of a magnanimous and noble character. But you are deep, Mr. Robert Candler. I know you better than you think I know you. I shall certainly marry you if there is no other way. But let us understand each other once and for all." While she spoke, Robert Candler had alternately flushed and paled, and when she ceased speaking he arose, and with a cynical smile upon his strong face said, "You surprise me, Jane. I thought you had more self-control, more pride. Of course, you are right. I am buying you, and I knew that you knew it, but I thought you would prefer to pretend that it was otherwise. I thought I should have thought your self-respect and your Porter pride would have shrunk from admitting even to yourself that you were a bought woman. But have it your own way, dear girl," he added lightly. "I am going to have you, and that is all that interests me." Without a word, the girl turned and left the room. Jane was not married before. She left with her father and Esmeralda for her little Wisconsin farm. Jane was not married before she left with her father and Esmeralda for her little Wisconsin farm. And as she coldly bid Robert Candler goodbye as her train pulled out, he called to her that he would join them in a week or two. At their destination, they were met by Clayton and Mr. Philander in a huge touring car belonging to the former, and quickly whirled away through the dense northern woods toward the little farm which the girl had not visited before since childhood. The farmhouse, which stood on little elevation some 100 years from the tenant house, had undergone a complete transformation during the 3 weeks that Clayton and Mr. Philander had been there. The former had imported a small army of carpenters and plasterers, plumbers and painters from a distant city, and what had been but a dilapidated shell when they reached it was now a cozy little 2-story house filled with every modern convenience procurable in so short a time. "Why, Mr. Clayton, what have you done?" cried Jane Porter, her heart sinking within her as she realized the probable size of the expenditure that had been made. "Shh," cautioned Clayton. "Don't let your father guess. If you don't tell him, he will never notice, and I simply couldn't think of him living in the terrible squalor and sordidness which Mr. Philander and I found. It was so little when I would like to do so much, Jane. For his sake, please, never mention it." "But you know that we can't repay you," cried the girl. "Why do you want to put me under such terrible obligations?" "Don't, Jane," said Clayton sadly. "If it had been just you, believe me, I wouldn't have done it, for I knew from the start that it would only hurt me in your eyes. But I couldn't think of that dear old man living in the hole we found here. Won't you please believe that I did it just for him, and give me that little crumb of pleasure at least?" "I do believe you, Mr. Clayton," said the girl, "because I know you are big enough and generous enough to have done it just for him. And, oh, Cecil, I wish I might repay you as you deserve, as you would wish." "Why can't you, Jane?" "Because I love another." "Candler?" "No." "But you are going to marry him. He told me as much before I left Baltimore." The girl winced. "Wince?" "I do not love him," she said, almost proudly. "Is it because of the money, Jane?" She nodded. "Then I am so much less desirable than Candler. I have money enough, and far more for every need," he said bitterly. "I do not love you, Cecil," she said, "but I respect you. If I must disgrace myself by such a bargain with any man, I prefer that it be one I already despise. I should loathe the man to whom I sold myself without love, whomsoever he might be. You will be happier," she concluded, "alone with my respect and friendship than with me and my contempt." He did not press the matter further, but if ever a man had murder in his heart, it was William Cecil Clayton, Lord Greystoke, when a week later Robert Candler drew up before the farmhouse in his purring 6-cylinder. A week passed, a tense, uneventful but uncomfortable week for all the inmates of the little Wisconsin farmhouse. Candler was insistent that Jane marry him at once. At length she gave in from sheer loathing of the continued and hateful importuning. It was agreed that on the morrow Candler was to drive to town and bring back the license and a minister. Clayton had wanted to leave as soon as the plan was announced, but the girl's tired, hopeless look kept him. He could not desert her. Something might happen yet. He tried to console himself by thinking, and in his heart he knew that it would require but a tiny spark to turn his hatred for Candler into the bloodlust of the killer. Early the next morning, Candler set out for town. In the east, smoke could be seen lying low over the forest, for a fire had been raging for a week not far from them, but the wind still lay in the west, and no danger threatened them. About noon, Jane started off for a walk. She would not let Clayton accompany her. She wanted to be alone, she said, and he respected her wishes. In the house, Professor Porter and Mr. Philander were immersed in an absorbing discussion of some weighty scientific problem. Esmeralda dozed in the kitchen, and Clayton, heavy-eyed after a sleepless night, threw himself down upon the couch in the living room and soon dropped into a fitful slumber. To the east, the black smoke clouds rose higher into the heavens. Suddenly, they eddied, and then commenced to drift rapidly toward the west. On and on they came. The inmates of the tenant house were gone, for it was market day, and none was there to see the rapid approach of the fiery demon. Soon the flames had spanned the road to the south and cut off Candler's return. A little fluctuation of the wind now carried the path of the forest fire to the north, then blew back, and the flames nearly stood still, as though held in leash by some master hand. Suddenly, out of the northeast, a great black car came careening down the road. With a jolt, it stopped before the cottage, and a black-haired giant leaped out to run up onto the porch. Without a pause, he rushed into the house. On the couch lay Clayton. The man started in surprise, but with a bound was at the side of the sleeping man. Shaking him roughly by the shoulder, he cried, "My God, Clayton, are you all mad here? Don't you know you are nearly surrounded by fire? Where is Miss Porter?" Clayton sprang to his feet. He did not recognize the man, but he understood the words and was upon the veranda in a bound. "Scott!" he cried, and then dashing back into the house. "Jane! Jane! Where are you?" In an instant, Esmeralda, Professor Porter, and Mr. Philander had joined the two men. "Where is Miss Jane?" cried Clayton, seizing Esmeralda by the shoulders and shaking her roughly. "Oh, Gabrielle, Mr. Clayton, she done gone for a walk." "Hasn't she come back yet?" And without waiting for a reply, Clayton dashed out into the yard, followed by the others. "Which way did she go?" cried the black-haired giant of Esmeralda. "Down that road," cried the frightened woman, pointing toward the south, where a mighty wall of roaring flames shut out the view. "Put these people into the other car," shouted the stranger to Clayton. "I saw one as I drove up, and get them out of here by the north road." "Leave my car here. If I find Miss Porter, we shall need it. If I don't, no one will need it. Do as I say." As Clayton hesitated, and then they saw the lithe figure bound away across the clearing, toward the northwest, where the forest still stood, untouched by flame. In each rose the unaccountable feeling that a great responsibility had been raised from their shoulders, a kind of implicit confidence in the power of the stranger to save Jane if she could be saved. "Who was that? Who was that?" asked Professor Porter. I don't know," replied Clayton. "He called me by my name, and he knew Jane, for he asked for her, and he called Esmeralda by name. There was something most startling familiar about him," exclaimed Mr. Philander, "and yet, bless me, I know I never saw him before." "Tut tut," cried Professor Porter. "Most remarkable. Who could it have been, and why do I feel that Jane is safe, now that he has set out in search of her?" "I can't tell you, Professor," said Clayton soberly, "but I know I have the same uncanny feeling." "But come," he cried, We must get out of here ourselves, or we shall be shut off." And the party hastened toward Clayton's car. When Jane turned to retrace her steps homeward, she was alarmed to note how near the smoke of the forest fire seemed. And as she hastened onward, her alarm became almost a panic when she perceived that the rushing flames were rapidly forcing their way between herself and the cottage. At length she was compelled to turn into the dense thicket and attempt to force her way to the west in an effort to encircle around the flames and reach the house. In a short time the futility of her attempt became apparent, and then her one hope lay in retracing her steps to the road and flying for her life to the south, toward the town. The 20 minutes that it took her to regain the road was all that had been needed to cut off her retreat as effectually as her advance had been cut off before. A short run down the road brought her to a horrified stand. For there before her was another wall of flame. An arm of the main conflagration had shot out a half-mile south of its parent to embrace this tiny strip of road in its implacable clutches. Jane knew that it was useless again to attempt to force her way through the undergrowth. She had tried it once and failed. Now she realized that it would be but a matter of minutes ere the whole place between the north and the south would be a seething mass of billowing flames. Calmly, the girl kneeled down in the dust of the roadway and prayed for strength to meet her fate bravely, and for the delivery of her father and her friends from death. Suddenly, she heard her name being called aloud through the forest. "Jane! Jane Porter!" It rang strong and clear, but in a strange voice. "Here!" she called in reply. "Here in the roadway!" Then through the branches of the trees she saw a figure swinging with the speed of a squirrel. A veering of the wind blew a cloud of smoke about them, and she could no longer see the man who was speeding toward her. But suddenly she felt a great arm about her. Then she was lifted up, and she felt the rushing of the wind and the occasional brush of branches as she was borne along. She opened her eyes. Far below her lay the undergrowth and the hard earth. About her was the waving foliage of the forest. From tree to tree swung the giant figure which bore her, and it seemed to Jane that she was lying over in a dream, the experience that had been hers in that far African jungle. Oh, if it were but the same man who had borne her so swiftly through the tangled verdure on that other day. But that was impossible. Yet who else in all the world was there with the strength and agility to do what this man was now doing? She stole a sudden glance at the face close to hers, and then she gave a little frightened gasp. It was he! "My forest man!" she murmured. "No, I must be delirious." "Yes, your man, Jane Porter. Your savage primeval man come out of the jungle to claim his mate, the woman who has run away from him," he added almost fiercely. "I did not run away," she whispered. "I would only consent to leave when they had waited a week for you to return." They had come to a point beyond the fire now, and he had turned back to the clearing. Side by side they were walking toward the cottage. The wind had changed once more, and the fire was burning back upon itself. Another hour like that, and it would be burned out. "Why did you not return?" she asked. "I was nursing Darnaud. He was badly wounded." "Ah, I knew it!" she exclaimed. "They said you had gone to join the blacks, that they were your people." He laughed. "But you did not believe them, Jane." "No. What shall I call you?" she asked. "What is your name?" "I was Tarzan of the Apes when you first knew me," he said. "Tarzan of the Apes!" she cried, And that was your note, I answered when I left. Yes. Who did you think it was? I do not know, only that it could not be yours, for Tarzan of the Apes had written in English, and you could not understand a word of any language. Again he laughed. It is a long story, but it was I who wrote that I could not speak, and now Darnaud has made matters worse by teaching me to speak French instead of English. Come, he added, jump into my car. We must overtake your father. They are only a little way ahead. And as they drove along, he said, Then when you said in your note to Tarzan of the Apes that you loved another, you might have met me? I might have, she answered simply. But in Baltimore, oh, how I have searched for you. They told me you would possibly be married by now, and that a man named Candler had come up here to wed you. Is that true? Yes. Do you love him? No. Do you love me? She buried her face in his hands. She buried her face in her hands. I am promised to another. I cannot answer you, Tarzan of the Apes, she cried. You have answered. Now, tell me why you would marry one you do not love. My father owes him money. Suddenly, there came back to Tarzan the memory of the letters he had read, and the name Robert Candler, and the hinted trouble which he had been unable to understand then. He smiled. If your father had not lost the treasure, you would not feel forced to keep your promise to this man Candler? I could ask him to release me, and if he refused, I have given my promise. He was silent for a moment. The car was plunging along the uneven road at a reckless pace, for the fire showed threateningly at their right, and another change of the wind might sweep it on with raging fury across this one avenue of escape. Finally, they passed the danger point, and Tarzan reduced their speed. Suppose I should ask him, ventured Tarzan. He would scarcely accede to the demand of a stranger, said the girl, especially one who wanted me himself. Turquoise did, said Tarzan grimly. Jane shuddered and looked fearfully up at the giant figure beside her, for she knew that he meant the great anthropod he had killed in her defense. This is not the African jungle, she said. You are no longer a savage beast. You are a gentleman, and gentlemen do not kill in cold blood. I am still a wild beast at heart, he said in a low voice, as though to himself. Again they were silent for a time. Jane, said the man at length, if you were free, would you marry me? She did not reply at once, but he waited patiently. The girl was trying to collect her thoughts. What did she know of this strange creature at her side? What did he know of himself? Who was he? Who his parents? Why, his very name echoed his mysterious origin and his savage life. He had no name. Could she be happy with this jungle waif? Could she find anything in common with a husband whose life had been spent in the treetops of an African wilderness, frolicking and fighting with fierce anthropods, tearing his food from the quivering flank of fresh killed prey, sinking his strong teeth into raw flesh, and tearing away his portion while his mates growled and fought about him for their share? Could he ever rise to her social sphere? Could she bear to think of sinking to his? Would either be happy in such a horrible misalliance? You do not answer, he said. Do you shrink from wounding me? I do not know what answer to make, said Jane sadly. I do not know my own mind. You do not love me then? He asked in a level tone. Do not ask me. You will be happier without me. You were never meant for the formal restrictions and conventionalities of society. Civilization would become irksome to you, and in a little while you would long for the freedom of your old life. a life to which I am as totally unfitted as you to mine." "I think I understand you," he replied quietly. "I shall not urge you, for I would rather see you happy and to be happy myself. I see now that you could not be happy with an ape." There was just the faintest tinge of bitterness in his voice. "Don't," she remonstrated. "Don't say that. You do not understand." But before she could go on, a sudden turn in the road brought them into the midst of a little hamlet. Before them stood Clayton's car, surrounded by the party he had brought from the cottage. The final chapter of Tarzan of the Apes. Chapter 28. Conclusion. At the sight of Jane, cries of relief and delight broke from every lip, and as Tarzan's car stopped beside the other, Professor Porter caught his daughter in his arms. For a moment, no one noticed Tarzan sitting silently in his seat. Clayton was the first to remember, and turning, held out his hand. "How can we ever thank you?" he exclaimed. "You have saved us all. You called me by name at the cottage, but I do not seem to recall yours, though there is something very familiar about you. It is as though I had known you well under very different conditions a long time ago." Tarzan smiled as he took the proffered hand.
Proffered.
Proffer. Hold out something to someone for acceptance. Offer. Tarzan smiled as he took the proffered hand. "You are quite right, Monsieur Clayton," he said in French. "You will pardon me if I do not speak to you in English. I am just learning it, and while I understand it fairly well, I speak it very poorly." "But who are you?" insisted Clayton, speaking in French this time himself. "Tarzan of the Apes." Clayton started back in surprise. "By Jove!" he exclaimed. "It is true." And Professor Porter and Mr. Philander pressed forward to add their thanks to Clayton's and to voice their surprise and pleasure at seeing their jungle friend so far from his savage home. The party now entered the modest little hostelry, where Clayton soon made arrangements for their entertainment. They were sitting in the little stuffy parlor when the distant chugging of an approaching automobile caught their attention. Mr. Philander, who was sitting near the window, looked out as the car drew in sight, finally stopping beside the other automobiles. "Bless me," said Mr. Philander, a shade of annoyance in his tone. "It is Mr. Candler. I had thought, how very happy we should be that he was not caught in the fire," he ended lamely. "Tut, tut, Mr. Philander," said Professor Porter. "Tut, tut. I've often admonished my pupils to count 10 before speaking. Were I you, Mr. Philander, I should count at least 1,000 and then maintain a discreet silence." "Bless me, yes," acquiesced Mr. Philander. "But who is the clerical-appearing gentleman with him?" Jane blanched. Clayton moved uneasily in his chair. Professor Porter removed his spectacles nervously and breathed upon them, but replaced them on his nose without wiping. The ubiquitous Esmeralda grunted. Only Tarzan did not comprehend. Presently, Robert Candler burst into the room. "Thank God!" he cried. "I feared the worst. until I saw your car, Clayton. I was cut off on the south road and had to go away back to town, and then strike east to this road. I thought we'd never reach the cottage. No one seemed to enthuse much. Tarzan eyed Robert Candler as Sabor eyes her prey. Jane glanced at him and coughed nervously. Mr. Candler, she said, this is Monsieur Tarzan, an old friend. Candler turned and extended his hand. Tarzan rose and bowed as only D'Arnaud could have taught a gentleman to do it, but he did not seem to see Candler's hand. Nor did Candler appear to notice the oversight. This is the Reverend Mr. Toulsley, Jane, said Candler, turning to the clerical party behind him. Mr. Toulsley, Miss Porter. Mr. Toulsley bowed and beamed. Candler introduced him to the others. We can have the ceremony at once, Jane, said Candler. Then you and I can catch the midnight train in town. Tarzan understood the plan instantly. He glanced out of half-closed eyes at Jane, but he did not move. The girl hesitated. The room was tense with the silence of taut nerves. All eyes turned toward Jane, awaiting her reply. Can't we wait a few days? She asked. I am all unstrung. I have been through so much today. Candler felt the hostility that emanated from each member of the party. It made him angry. We have waited as long as I intend to wait, he said roughly. You have promised to marry me. I shall be played with no longer. I have the license, and here is the preacher. Come, Mr. Toulsley. Come, Mr. Toulsley. Come, Jane. There are plenty of witnesses, more than enough, he added with a disagreeable inflection, and taking Jane Porter by the arm, he started to lead her toward the waiting minister. But scarcely had he taken a single step, ere a heavy hand closed upon his arm with a grip of steel. Another hand shot to his throat, and in a moment he was being shaken high above the floor as a cat might shake a mouse. Jane turned in horrified surprise toward Tarzan, and as she looked into his face, she saw the crimson band upon his forehead that she had seen that other day in far distant Africa, when Tarzan of the Apes had closed in mortal combat with the great anthropod, Turquoise. She knew that murder lay in that savage heart, and with a little cry of horror, she sprang forward to plead with the ape man. But her fears were more for Tarzan than for Candler. She realized the stern retribution which justice metes to the murderer.
Metes.
Metes. M-E-T-E-S. Dispense or allot justice, a punishment or harsh treatment. Mete. She realized the stern retribution which justice metes to the murderer. Before she could reach them, however, Clayton had jumped to Tarzan's side and attempted to drag Candler from his grasp. With a single sweep of one mighty arm, the Englishman was hurled across the room, and then Jane laid a firm white hand upon Tarzan's wrist and looked up into his eyes. For my sake, she said. The grasp upon Candler's throat relaxed. Tarzan looked down into the beautiful face before him. Do you wish this to live? He asked in surprise. I do not wish him to die at your hands, my friend, she replied. I do not wish you to become a murderer. Tarzan removed his hand from Candler's throat. Do Do you release her from her promise? He asked. It is the price of your life. Candler, gasping for breath, nodded. Will you go away and never molest her further? Again the man nodded his head, his face distorted by fear of death that had been so close. Tarzan released him, and Candler staggered toward the door. In another moment he was gone, and the terror-stricken preacher with him. Tarzan turned toward Jane. May I speak with you for a moment alone? He asked. The girl nodded and started toward the door, leading to the narrow veranda of the little hotel. She passed out to await Tarzan, and so did not hear the conversation which followed. Wait, cried Professor Porter, as Tarzan was about to follow. The professor had been stricken dumb with surprise by the rapid developments of the past few minutes. Before we go further, sir, I should like an explanation of the events which have just transpired. By what right, sir, did you interfere between my daughter and Mr. Candler? I had promised him her hand, sir, and regardless of our personal likes or dislikes, sir, that promise must be kept. I interfered, Professor Porter, replied Tarzan, because your daughter does not love Mr. Candler. She does not wish to marry him. That is enough for me to know. You do not know what you have done, said Professor Porter. Now he will doubtless refuse to marry her. He most certainly will, said Tarzan emphatically. And further, added Tarzan, you need not fear that your pride will suffer, Professor Porter, for you will be able to pay the Candler person what you owe him the moment you reach home. Tut, tut, sir, exclaimed Professor Porter. What do you mean, sir? Your treasure has been found, said Tarzan. What? What is that you are saying? Cried the professor. You are mad, man. It cannot be. It is, though. It was I who stole it, not knowing either its value or to whom it belonged. I saw the sailors bury it, and, ape-like, I had to dig it up and bury it again elsewhere. When D'Arnaud told me what it was and what it meant to you, I returned to the jungle and recovered it. It had caused so much crime and suffering and sorrow that D'Arnaud thought it best not to attempt to bring the treasure itself on here, as had been my intention. So I have brought a letter of credit instead. Here it is, Professor Porter. And Tarzan drew an envelope from his pocket and handed it to the astonished professor. $241,000. The treasure was most carefully appraised by experts, but lest there should be any question in your mind, D'Arnaud himself bought it and is holding it for you, should you prefer the treasure to the credit. To the already great burden of the obligations we owe you, sir, said Professor Porter with trembling voice, is now added this greatest of all services. You have given me the means to save my honor. Clayton, who had left the room a moment after Candler, now returned. Pardon me, he said. I think we had better try to reach town before dark and take the first train out of this forest. A native just rode by from the north, who reports that the fire is moving slowly in this direction. This announcement broke up further conversation, and the entire party went out to the waiting automobiles. Clayton, with Jane, the professor, and Esmeralda occupied Clayton's car, while Tarzan took Mr. Philander in with him. Bless me, exclaimed Mr. Philander as the car moved off after Clayton. Who would ever have thought it possible? The last time I saw you, you were a veritable wild man, skipping about among the branches of a tropical African forest. And now you are driving me along a Wisconsin road in a French automobile. Bless me, but it is most remarkable." "Yes," assented Tarzan. And then after a pause, "Mr. Philander, do you recall any of the details of the finding and burying of 3 skeletons found in my cabin beside that African jungle?" "Very distinctly, sir, very distinctly," replied Mr. Philander. "Was there anything peculiar about any of those skeletons?" Mr. Philander eyed Tarzan narrowly. "Why do you ask?" "It means a great deal to me to know," replied Tarzan. "Your answer may clear up a mystery. It can do no worse, at any rate, than to leave it still a mystery. I have been entertaining a theory concerning those skeletons for the past 2 months, and I want you to answer my question to the best of your knowledge. Were the 3 skeletons you buried all human skeletons?" "No," said Mr. Philander. "The smallest one, the one found in the crib, was the skeleton of an anthropoid ape." "Thank you," said Tarzan. In the car ahead, Jane was thinking fast and furiously. She had felt the purpose for which Tarzan had asked a few words with her, and she knew that she must be prepared to give him an answer in the very near future. He was not the sort of person one could put off, and somehow that very thought made her wonder if she did not really fear him. And could she love where she feared? She realized the spell that had been upon her in the depths of that far-off jungle, but there was no spell of enchantment now in prosaic Wisconsin. Nor did the immaculate young Frenchman appeal to the primal woman in her, as had the stalwart forest god. Did she love him? She did not know now. She glanced at Clayton out of the corner of her eye. Was not here a man trained in the same school of environment in which she had been trained? A man with social position and culture such as she had been taught to consider as the prime essentials to congenial association. Did not her best judgment point to this young English nobleman, whose love she knew to be of the sort a civilized woman could crave, a civilized woman should crave, as the logical mate for such as herself? Could she love Clayton? She could see no reason why she could not. Jane was not coldly calculating by nature, but training and environment and heredity had all combined to teach her to reason even in matters of the heart. That she had been carried off by her feet by the strength of the young giant when his great arms were about her in the distant African forest, and again today in the Wisconsin woods, seemed to her only attributable to a temporary mental reversion to type on her part, to the psychological appeal of the primeval man to the primeval woman in her nature. If he should never touch her again, she reasoned, she would never feel attracted toward him. She had not loved him then. It had been nothing more than a passing hallucination, superinduced by excitement and by personal contact. Excitement would not always mark their future relations, should she marry him, and the power of personal contact eventually would be dulled by familiarity. Again she glanced at Clayton. He was very handsome and every inch a gentleman. She should be very proud of such a husband. And then he spoke. A minute sooner or a minute later might have made all the difference in the world to 3 lives. But chance stepped in and pointed out to Clayton the psychological moment. "You are free now, Jane," he said. "Won't you say yes? I will devote my life to making you very happy." Yes, she whispered. That evening in the little waiting room at the station, Tarzan caught Jane alone for a moment. "You are free now, Jane," he said, "and I have come across the ages, out of the dim and distant past, from the lair of the primeval man to claim you. For your sake I have become a civilized man. For your sake I have crossed oceans and continents. For your sake I will be whatever you will me to be. I can make you happy, Jane, in the life you know and love best. Will you marry me?" For the first time she realized the depths of the man's love. All that he had accomplished in so short a time, slowly for love of her. Turning her head, she buried her face in her arms. What had she done? Because she had been afraid she might succumb to the pleas of this giant, she had burned her bridges behind her, in her groundless apprehension that she might make a terrible mistake. She had made a worse one. And then she told him all, told him the truth, word by word, without attempting to shield herself or condone her error. "What can we do?" he asked. "You have admitted that you love me, and you know that I love you, but I do not know the ethics of society by which you are governed. I shall leave the decision to you, for you know best what will be for your eventual welfare." "I cannot tell him, Tarzan," she said. "He too loves me, and he is a good man. I could never face you nor any other honest person if I repudiated my promise to Mr. Clayton. I shall have to keep it, and you must help me bear the burden, though we may not see each other again after tonight." The others were entering the room now, and Tarzan turned toward the little window. But he saw nothing outside. Within he saw a patch of green sward surrounded by a matted mass of gorgeous tropical plants and flowers, and above the waving foliage of mighty trees, and over all the blue of an equatorial sky. In the center of the green sward, a young woman sat upon a little mound of earth, and beside her sat a young giant. They ate pleasant fruit and looked at each other's eyes and smiled. They were very happy, and they were all alone. His thoughts were broken in upon by the station agent, who entered asking if there was a gentleman by the name of Tarzan in the party. "I am Monsieur Tarzan," said the ape man. "Here is a message for you," forwarded from Baltimore. "It is a cablegram from Paris." Tarzan took the envelope and tore it open. The message was from Darno. It read, "Fingerprints prove you Greystoke. Congratulations, Darno." As Tarzan finished reading, Clayton entered and came toward him with extended hand. Here was the man who had Tarzan's title and Tarzan's estates, and was going to marry the woman whom Tarzan loved, the woman who loved Tarzan. A single word from Tarzan would make a great difference in this man's life. It would take away his title and his lands and his castles, and it would take them away from Jane Porter also. "I say, old man," cried Clayton, "I haven't had a chance to thank you for all you've done for us. It seems as though you had your hands full saving our lives in Africa and here." "I'm awfully glad you came on here. We must get better acquainted. I often thought about you, and the remarkable circumstances of your environment." "If it's any of my business, how the devil did you ever get into that bally jungle?" "I was born there," said Tarzan quietly. "My mother was an ape, and of course she couldn't tell me much about it. I never knew who my father was." The end. Good night, baby Elias.